Hello, welcome back to the History Sphere. My name is Greg. I am your host. What you're about to hear is the second part of a multi-part series on the Creole Affair. If you haven't yet heard part one and you're jumping in right in part two, you're going to be missing some context. I would suggest you go back and listen to part one now. On the morning of November 9th, 1841, a Bahamian pilot boat captain was watching the entrance to the harbor for incoming ships. It was his job to guide incoming ships through the narrow strait into the harbor because he, being a local sailor, was familiar with the tides and currents in the area. It probably was an ordinary day for him. He did this every day. That morning, he spotted a particular ship approaching the harbor, a ship flying the American flag. To him, again, this would not have been unusual. Lots of American ships sailed in and out of Nassau Harbor every day. Nassau at this time was one of the busiest ports in the Caribbean. After he approached this ship, he discovered that there was something very unusual about this ship, because this ship was the Creole. The Creole had been a slave ship. And just 2 days before, a group of 19 enslaved men on the Creole had risen up and taken control of the ship. They had forced one of the slave overseers, William Merritt, who was an experienced sailor, to navigate the ship to Nassau in the Bahamas. The Bahamas at that time were British soil, and the British Empire had abolished slavery in 1834 with the final abolition and freedom of all formerly enslaved people in the British Caribbean becoming effective in 1838, just a few years before. This pilot boat captain was a black man. All of his crew, likewise, were black men. We don't know exactly who they were. History did not record their names as far as I know. It's likely, being black men in the Bahamas in 1841, that at least some of them had formerly been enslaved. As they approached the Creole, they boarded the Creole. They talked to the men who had taken control of the ship. They talked with the other Creole captives, and they learned what had happened. They informed the formerly enslaved on board the Creole that they were now free because there was no such thing as slavery in the British Caribbean colonies. They then proceeded to do their job like they would with any other ship, and they guided the ship into the harbor. As they entered the harbor, another ship came up alongside the Creole. This was the harbor master's ship. It's noteworthy that the harbor master was also a black man. It was his job to inspect incoming ships, to make sure they were carrying legitimate cargo, and to ensure that they paid any relevant taxes or duties that were due on them. As his ship came up alongside the Creole, First Mate Zephaniah Gifford, who had been hiding in the rigging since the uprising took place, saw his opportunity, and he jumped from the Creole onto the harbor master's ship. He told the harbor master that there had been a mutiny aboard, demanded that the ship not be allowed to come to harbor, and that none of the people on board the ship be allowed to disembark until he's had a chance to speak with the American consul on the island. Gifford was well aware that slavery had been abolished in the British Caribbean colonies, and he knew that if the enslaved on board the Creole were allowed to disembark and set foot on British soil, that they would be freed, and he sought to prevent this. The American consul in Nassau was John F. Bacon. Originally from Massachusetts, he had built a successful law practice in his adopted hometown of Albany, New York, where he had also served as clerk of the state senate prior to his appointment as the American consul in the Bahamas. There had been other similar incidents in the Bahamas before that he had had to deal with. Never a slave uprising, but there had been multiple ships that, through force of nature, had shipwrecked in the Bahamas somewhere that had been slave ships where the inhabitants had been freed. And when he first heard about this, he may have thought that this was another ordinary shipwreck or something that happened in the course of ordinary affairs. Of course, it turned out that this was very different. And when he met with Zephaniah Gifford must have looked like he'd been through the ringer. According to witness accounts, his clothes were torn. He had cuts and blood on his face. Remember from episode 1, he had been grazed by a bullet in the back of his head. So there was a wound there and lots of blood that he hadn't had a chance to clean yet. This image must have shocked the Consul Bacon. Consul Bacon probably didn't know immediately how to handle this situation. He had enough on his plate already. The government he represented at this time was in the midst of a political crisis. The President of the United States at this time was John Tyler. John Tyler had not been elected president, he had been elected vice president, and only became president when William Henry Harrison became the first U.S. president to die in office, only 7 months earlier. The Harrison-Tyler ticket had been elected as the nominees of the Whig Party in the 1840 election. America at this time had a two-party system that would not look unfamiliar to modern observers familiar with the two-party system in the United States today with the Democrats and the Republicans. But in some ways it was also very different. The Whig Party was formed in the 1830s as an opposition party to the Jacksonian Democrats, who prior to the formation of the Whig Party were really the only major party. The Federalist Party had fallen apart years ago, and Jackson had been elected in 1828 as a Democratic Republican, and all of his opponents in that election also ran as Democratic Republicans, the party of Thomas Jefferson. The split in the party came over the person of Andrew Jackson, and the party split into the Jacksonian Democrats, which formed the basis of today's modern Democratic Party, and the Whigs. The Whigs were the very definition of a big tent party. There were many different ideas and interests that constituted the Whig Party. Essentially, anybody that was opposed to Andrew Jackson, either politically or personally, fell under the umbrella of the Whig Party. Now, to understand this, you have to understand a little bit about Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was a pivotal figure in American history. Andrew Jackson was the first president who came from what you could call very humble origins. He was the first president to both run as and govern as a populist. And the party that he formed, the Jacksonian Democrats, while somewhat different from today's Democratic Party, did form the blueprints, the foundation of what would become the modern Democratic Party. Jackson was all about expanding the franchise and giving more power to the people, but the people should be in quotes. Because when Jackson talked about the people, he meant white men. He did not want anybody else included. He was openly racist. Andrew Jackson is somebody who was not just racist by today's standards, but was racist for his time. And people understood it at the time. Andrew Jackson was all about expanding the rights of poor white men. He believed in democracy for white men, but that was an exclusive club. For white men, whether they owned property, whether they came from the aristocracy or not, civil rights and enfranchisement were absolute. For everybody else, they were not full members of his democracy. In this opposition to Jackson, you had a very broad coalition of different groups and different interests. Jackson, for one, was very pro-slavery. He was a Southerner, he was a slave owner, he was a racist, and so New England abolitionists joined the Whig Party to oppose Jackson. At the same time, you had the very traditional Southern slave-owning aristocracy that wanted to keep power in the hands of the few and not extend full voting rights and full participation in our republic to propertyless poor white men that they felt were uneducated and unable to assume the responsibilities of government. They also felt that if people didn't have property, they didn't have as much of a stake in the republic and shouldn't have as much of a say in the republic. So even though they were pro-slavery and Jackson was pro-slavery, they differed on the social stratification between white men. And so you had old school Southern aristocrats that were pro-slavery allied in the same party as New England abolitionists. And then you had some people who even agreed with Jackson's wider aims, but objected to the way he did things. And some of those ended up in the Whig Party as well. This two-party system with the Whigs and the Jacksonian Democrats was built on the premise of sweeping slavery to the side. The partisan divide was not over slavery, it was over what you thought of Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was a figure today that I think there's a fair comparison to someone like Donald Trump in today's politics, in that what you thought of him personally said a lot about where you stood politically. And he was a very polarizing figure. People were either with him or against him. And so it's important to note that neither party embraced anti-slavery politics on a national level at this time. However, the Democrats were widely seen and understood to be the more pro-slavery party because Jackson, being a vehement defender of states' rights, not exclusively with slavery, but with many issues, but especially with slavery, that slavery was an issue left to the states to decide, and that within those states, the federal government had no power and no place in seeking to regulate or limit slavery in the states. It was an institution protected by state law, and the states had absolute power over it. That was Jackson's belief on the national politics of slavery. The Democrats were considered the more pro-slavery party. There really weren't any anti-slavery Democrats. There were Democrats that were not pro-slavery. There were Northern Democrats that preferred to ignore slavery for the sake of unity. But there were not really, at least on a national level, anybody from the Jacksonian Democrats that was anti-slavery. On the other hand, the Whig Party was very much divided on slavery. Like I said, it was a very big tent party that combined traditional Southern slaveholding aristocrats in the same political party as New England and Ohio abolitionists. It was something that in hindsight was unsustainable. It wasn't clear at the time that slavery was going to become the paramount issue in American politics that was destined to divide the country and ultimately spark a civil war. Shout out to Nikki Haley. The idea among the political elite at this time was that we can continue to kind of shove slavery to the side. Let's deal with these other issues and not let slavery divide us. So these very different groups with very different interests, they would fight each other on the slavery issue. Don't get me wrong. People were still talking about slavery. Slavery was still a very divisive issue at this time, but it didn't divide the party or define the two-party system. You could be pro-slavery and be a Whig. You could be anti-slavery and be a Whig. You could be an abolitionist and be a Whig in the same party, support the same presidential candidate as aristocratic Southern slave owners. The Democratic Party didn't really have many anti-slavery voices, but the Democratic Party had very pro-slavery voices, and then a lot of people that just didn't want to talk about slavery, especially Northern Democrats. And there was almost a conscious effort to prevent the country from being split on sectional lines, meaning having a Northern and a Southern party. Because there was, even at this time, in the 1840s, an understanding that if the party system were to split solely along sectional lines over the divide over slavery, that could very well lead to civil war, which it ultimately did. William Henry Harrison was the first president elected from the Whig Party. Jackson had left the presidency in 1837. Martin Van Buren was his hand-picked successor from the Democratic Party. And so he was very much seen as an extension of the Jackson years. And so even though Jackson had long retired from American politics at this point, the Whig Party was still all about opposing Jackson and what he stood for. William Henry Harrison was the first Whig president elected. Harrison was a senator from Ohio. William Henry Harrison was not particularly anti-slavery, even though he represented a free state in Ohio, a state where slavery had never been legal to begin with. He was not originally from Ohio. He was not born there. He was originally born in Virginia to an aristocratic slave-owning family. He'd grown up owning slaves. He'd owned slaves himself. He had defended slavery. He had argued against limitations on the spread of slavery into new Western territories. And yet, when he became a national political figure, he followed suit of what other presidential candidates before him had done, and he kind of shut his mouth about slavery. He didn't want to answer questions about slavery. He didn't want to talk about it. Yet, you did have people in the Whig Party that were very concerned with slavery and with both defending slavery and also people that were against slavery. So he had to walk that delicate line. So to the Southern Whigs, he was a Northerner, even though his politics before he became a national figure were very much in line with pro-slavery politics. He was a Northerner from a non-slaveholding state, and not only that, Ohio at this time was one of the hotbeds of the abolitionist movement. So there was some suspicion among Southern Whigs that he didn't really represent their interests. And so when the party nominated him, it was important to balance the ticket, that he pick a vice president who was a Southern slave owner. Enter John Tyler. John Tyler was chosen as Harrison's running mate because of his demographic qualities. He wasn't chosen for his intellect. He wasn't chosen for his experience. It's, to me, looking at the sources, it's beyond dispute. He was chosen as vice president because he was a slave owner from Virginia. He had a pulse, and he was physically present at the Whig National Convention. I think he's been unfairly maligned in history as someone who, because he wasn't chosen for his resume, was someone who was very unimpressive and did not have an impressive resume. In my research on this man, I found exactly the opposite to be true. I found him to be a very intelligent, hardworking, rather impressive person. He was born in Virginia to an aristocratic family from the Virginia slavocracy, the planter class. His father was good friends with Thomas Jefferson. He would have spent time around Thomas Jefferson growing up. Jefferson would have been a huge influence on the early development of his political ideas. At the age of 19, John Tyler became the youngest attorney ever admitted to the bar in the Commonwealth of Virginia, a record that still stands to this day, partially because you have to be 21 to be admitted to the bar in Virginia, and it seems as though he passed the bar and no one bothered to ask him how old he was. Regardless, he was admitted to the bar in Virginia at 19. He had served in the House of Delegates, the Virginia legislature, the U.S. House, and the U.S. Senate. Initially, he had aligned himself with the Jacksonian Democrats. His politics, and this is going to be important later, his politics, his core beliefs were very much aligned with Andrew Jackson and the Jacksonian Democrats. But he came to detest Andrew Jackson personally, not for what he did, but for how he did it. This came to a head during the Nullification Crisis of 1832. John Tyler, like Jackson, was a strong defender of the states' rights doctrine, that the states have a kind of supremacy over the federal government, that the state governments should have more say in their internal affairs than the federal government should have. And the Nullification Crisis, that would have to be a whole different podcast series to talk about the Nullification Crisis. But I'll just give you some cliff notes here. The Nullification Crisis had to do with tariffs passed by the federal government. And when we talk about tariffs at this time in the 1830s, there was no income tax. There were no other really federal taxes to speak of at this time. Tariffs on imports were the federal government's main source of revenue during this time. The federal government passed import tariffs that South Carolina disagreed with. South Carolina claimed the right to pass their own state law to nullify a federal law, to pass a law within a state that essentially says, we are using our power as a state to nullify this law. This law does not apply in South Carolina. John Tyler very much took South Carolina's side in this. John Tyler believed that states should have the rights to nullify and cancel out a federal law that they disagreed with. He saw this as an important part of state sovereignty. Andrew Jackson, while he was a supporter of states' rights and slavery, he had a line. He felt that the Constitution gave the federal government the clear authority in this area to pass and enforce tariffs. The states, when they signed on to the Constitution, did not actually have the authority in this area like they did over other areas, like the institution of slavery, in which Jackson was a strong believer in states' rights. And Jackson actually was ready to use military force to bring South Carolina to heel. John Tyler stood against this and believed that Jackson's threats to use military force to force a state into line was tyrannical. And after this, he became more and more opposed to Andrew Jackson personally, if not politically. And more he aligned himself with the opposition, which would become the Whig Party, although it was not really called the Whig Party yet, even though he disagreed with the politics of many in that party. One of his main disagreements with the Whigs was the disagreement over the National Bank of the United States, whether there should be a central bank of the United States. Andrew Jackson and John Tyler were very much in alignment on this issue. Jackson was vehemently opposed to any form of central banking, which makes it somewhat ironic that his face can be found on the US $20 bill today. But where the divide really came to a head was when Jackson attempted to bypass Congress to abolish the Central Bank of the United States. Tyler did not believe he had the authority to do that without Congress, and opposed him on it. After he did it anyway, there was a resolution proposed in the Senate to censure President Jackson, which Tyler intended to support. At this time, senators were not directly elected by a vote of the people like they are today. Rather, at this time, senators were elected by the state legislatures and were accountable not to the people but to the legislature. The state of Virginia had a legislature that was stacked in favor of the Jacksonian Democrats, and they passed their own resolution mandating that their senator in their name oppose the censure resolution against Jackson. John Tyler voted for it anyway because he believed it was right, and understanding that he would lose his Senate seat, he resigned. You could be forgiven for thinking that this was the end of his political career, but in fact it was a new beginning of his political career on the national stage. After this, he was very much lionized by the Whig Party as someone who had taken a principled stand against the tyrannical actions of Andrew Jackson. This led to him becoming more and more involved in the national politics of the Whig Party and him being present at the convention in 1840, where he was chosen as the running mate. It was understood that he was something of a wino, a Whig in name only. He really aligned with the Democrats more on most important issues, and this wasn't seen as a terribly consequential decision at the time. The vice presidency was seen as a very irrelevant office. No president had ever died in office, so why did it matter who the vice president was? Of course, in this case, it turned out to matter a lot because William Henry Harrison became the first president to die in office only a month into his term. This led to something of a political crisis because it wasn't clear what the succession had to look like. The Constitution was rather vague on this matter. It would later be clarified in the 25th Amendment, but there was no 25th Amendment at this time. There were only 12 amendments. None of them dealt with the presidential succession. So Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution reads, "In case of the removal of the president from office, or his death, resignation, or inability to discharge the powers and duties of the said office, the same shall devolve on the vice president, and the Congress may by law provide for the case of removal, death, resignation, or inability both of the president and vice president, declaring what officer shall then act as president, and such officer shall act accordingly until the disability be removed or a president shall be selected." Now, if that seems like legalese word salad to you, that's because it is. It wasn't clear what the succession was to look like. And since this had never happened before, John Tyler had to set the precedent for what it would look like. There was not really a lot of debate as to who the powers of the presidency would pass to. The Constitution was rather clear on that if he should be unable to discharge the powers and duties of said office, the same shall devolve on the vice president. So the question at the time was, is John Tyler the president, or is he still the vice president acting with the powers and duties of the office of president? There were a lot of people that thought he was merely the acting president and didn't want to recognize him as the legitimate president of the United States. After all, he had not been elected to that office. John Tyler took a decisive stand here. He said, I am the president. It's not just the powers and duties of the office that devolve to me, but the title and the stature of the office as well. In fact, for the rest of his presidency, and indeed even after his presidency, some people would send letters to him addressed to the vice president or to Mr. Vice President, and he would return those letters unopened. He wasn't just being egotistical. He felt it was important to the stability of the nation that there be a smooth and definitive transition, and that there be not just an acting president, but that someone actually occupy the office of the presidency. So he took the firm position, I am the president. If you do not address me as the president, I will not consider what you have to say. This set the precedent for future transitions, because while this was the first time this would happen, it would certainly not be the last. Indeed, it would happen multiple times within a generation. And what Tyler did by being decisive in that moment may have been one of the greatest achievements of his presidency, in that he set that precedent for how the transition would happen in the event of the death of the president. And that was followed and later codified into the Constitution in the 25th Amendment, along with some additional rules on the line of succession should both president and vice president die or be incapacitated. So here you had John Tyler, who had been elected as the vice president on a Whig ticket with a Whig president, but whose political ideology was at odds with many of the central beliefs and items on the platform of the Whig Party. He essentially agreed more often with the Democrats, and he was hated by his own party for that reason. And yet he was also hated by the Democrats because he was seen as someone who had betrayed them, who had betrayed Andrew Jackson, who was the leader of their party, and had stood against Jackson. And like I said earlier, what you thought of Jackson very much defined where you were politically. And so you have this president in the United States at this time who's hated by everybody. Nobody liked John Tyler. Indeed, after he took office, 5 of the 6 members of his cabinet resigned. The only one that remained, and this is going to be crucial for this story going forward, was the Secretary of State, Daniel Webster. Daniel Webster stayed on in his position not because he loved John Tyler. He probably didn't, although John Tyler, because of his perceived loyalty, would come to really like and trust Daniel Webster. Daniel Webster did not think that the United States could afford an abrupt gap and transition in the role of the Secretary of State. And for anyone who's unfamiliar with what the Secretary of State does, the Secretary of State is essentially the United States chief diplomat. They're in charge of the State Department, which is the Foreign Service, in charge of all diplomacy. They speak for the administration and for the government to foreign nations. Daniel Webster was a successful Massachusetts attorney who had argued multiple cases, including many landmark cases, in front of the United States Supreme Court. He had also served as a congressional representative and senator from Massachusetts. He had been one of the leaders of the anti-Jackson opposition, and therefore one of the founders of the Whig Party itself. He was one of these Northern Whigs that was not strong in his anti-slavery sentiment, which actually made him somewhat unique among Massachusetts politicians at this time, because the politics in the state of Massachusetts were strongly anti-slavery, even leaning abolitionist. Webster was one of those Northern Whigs who just kind of ignored slavery and preferred not to talk about it. He wasn't particularly pro-slavery. He wasn't particularly anti-slavery. He tiptoed around the issue. Webster was a Whig through and through. He believed in the core tenets of the Whig Party. And I suppose we should talk a little bit about what those tenets were. The Whigs were a mostly urban party. Rural farmers were more likely to be Jacksonian Democrats, both North and South. They were seen as a party by the Jacksonian Democrats, saw them as urban elites. They favored more capitalistic enterprises. They favored more government investment in infrastructure, things like railroads and internal improvements on a national level, whereas the Jacksonian Democrats either didn't believe in that at all or thought that it should be left to the states. One of the most important issues on the Whig platform was the idea that there needed to be a centralized banking system in the United States, something that the Jacksonian Democrats absolutely disagreed with. As I mentioned before, there were divisions over slavery and other issues within the Whig Party. By and large, those were the issues that united most Whigs, except for John Tyler, because John Tyler opposed both internal improvements and national investment in infrastructure and the national bank. He opposed both of those things and stood with the Democrats on those issues. But anyway, Webster was very strongly in support of all those things. He had been for years. So he had many profound disagreements with John Tyler. But he just did not think that the country could withstand a turnover at the position of Secretary of State at that time. And so he agreed to remain at his position as Secretary of State. And for this, he was largely seen as a traitor by members of the Whig Party, because the Whig Party was not standing by President Tyler. And in fact, they would pass a resolution to expel him from their party. So Tyler was not a member of either party during his presidency. Webster stayed on because, in particular, he thought it was too unstable and dangerous a time to be without the United States chief diplomat at his post, given the fraught and volatile nature of the relationship at that time between the United States and the United Kingdom. Today, after 2 world wars and many decades of the special relationship of the transatlantic alliance between the United States and the United Kingdom, it seems very natural to most people that the United States and the United Kingdom are the closest of allies. But in the first half of the 19th century especially, this was not the case. The two countries not only were not close allies, they were very much antagonistic towards one another. And it didn't help that they shared this long border on the Canadian border, which Canada was still British territory at that time, and this very narrow maritime border in the Caribbean. It led to a lot of tensions between the United States and the United Kingdom. The two countries were, at this point, a mere 25 years removed from fighting the War of 1812. The War of 1812 was the culmination of a lot of escalating issues between the United States and the United Kingdom in the aftermath of the American Revolution. It was fought over things like the border in the Great Lakes region, actual and perceived British support for raids by Native American tribes in the Northwest Territory. By far, I think the biggest issue, at least on the American side, was the issue of impressment. See, at this time, in the years leading up to the War of 1812, the British were at war with Napoleonic France, and they had a great need for manpower in their navy. And so the Royal Navy was empowered to impress sailors, as it was called, essentially force men against their will onto the crews of British warships. The men that would do this, that would board these ships and force men from other ships' crews, both in port and at sea, to join the Royal Navy, were known as press gangs. And that was a controversial issue within the UK itself. There were many people that were against this. The press gangs were reviled. They were especially hated by the Americans because the British did not limit themselves to doing this in British ports on British ships. They claimed the right to board any ship where there was a British subject on board, and any British subject, regardless of which flag they sailed under, could be impressed into the Royal Navy. Where this issue put them at odds with the United States was that many of these quote-unquote British subjects who were sailing under the American flag on American ships, they may have been born British subjects, but they had been naturalized as citizens of the United States. And so the way the Americans saw this is they were not making any distinction between natural-born U.S. citizens and naturalized citizens that were from the United Kingdom. It was seen as the British kidnapping American citizens and forcing them into service in the British Navy. So in 1812, the United States declared war on the United Kingdom. Now, there's arguments today over what the ultimate result of this war was. British and Canadians argue with Americans over who won this war. If you're interested, the podcast Our Fake History did a whole episode on trying to solve the question of who won the War of 1812. The host of that podcast, I believe, is Canadian. It's a fun listen. If you like my podcast, you'll probably like that one. During the course of the war, British forces did capture Washington, D.C., and they burned the White House and other civic buildings in Washington, D.C. to the ground. This was something that Americans had not forgotten about 25 years later. They were still angry about it. I'm told that in the White House today, it was rebuilt, but certain parts of the foundation, you can still see scorch marks from when the original White House on that foundation was set on fire and burned to the ground by the British. The Americans were defeated a lot in this war on the field by British forces, who were in many ways superior to the American forces. The Americans had some of their own victories, especially Andrew Jackson, coming back to Jackson, commanded American forces at the Battle of New Orleans, which was one of the great American victories of the war. At the end of the day, the status quo really didn't change. At the end of this war, impressment was stopped by the British. The British and the Americans signed a treaty, but the tensions remained high, even for decades after this war. As a relevant side note, the British, as they became more and more anti-slavery, like we discussed in the last episode, put on the Royal Navy the job of policing the Atlantic to stop the Atlantic slave trade. And to further this goal, they made bilateral treaties with many nations, allowing them to board those nations' ships off the coast of West Africa and inspect them for slaves to ensure that they were not engaged in this illegal slave trade. Because of their sensitivity over the issue of impressment, the United States would never sign such a treaty with the British. And so illegal slave traders on the Atlantic, almost universally, whether they were American ships or not, would fly the American flag to prevent the British from boarding them. Closer to the events at hand, in December 1837, there was a rebellion in Upper Canada, modern-day Ontario. Dissidents in that region staged a short-lived rebellion against the oligarchic system that was then ruling over the government in Upper Canada. The rebels were fighting because they wanted to live in a more democratic society. They wanted more democratic reforms. So they rose up in arms against the oligarchic British authorities in Upper Canada. The rebellion was pretty quickly crushed, but it garnered a lot of sympathy on the American side of the border. We all know how much Americans love spreading democracy. And when they saw a pro-democratic movement rise up in arms against their enemy, the British, just across the border, there were a lot of Americans that supported this and funneled money and supplies to the rebels. The U.S. government, for its part, did nothing to openly support the rebellion in Upper Canada. They saw it for what it was, something that was going to be short-lived, and it was not worth risking a war with the British to try and support this. That didn't stop individual American citizens from supporting the rebellion. Many of them did. One group of U.S. supporters was ferrying supplies across the Niagara River near Niagara Falls to the rebels in Canada, including weapons and ammunition that were being used against the Loyalist militia. The U.S. government, while it did not openly support supplying the rebels and took no part in it, did little to stop them from ferrying these supplies across the river. There was an American ship called the Caroline that was being used to ferry these supplies across the river to the rebels. And they were quite open about what they were doing. They didn't attempt to conceal their activities. They were just openly ferrying these supplies across an international border to support an insurrection in Canada. You can see why the British would be upset by this. On the night of December 29th, 1837, a force of Loyalist militia and Canadian law enforcement officers crossed the Niagara River into U.S. territory in a dramatic raid. During the course of the raid, they killed an American, a free black man named Amos Durfee, and sent the flaming ship over the falls before retreating back across the Niagara to the safety of Canada and British territory. As news of this spread, all of America was outraged. There were calls for war on the floor of Congress. They felt that the British had crossed a line here. I know it's difficult to imagine we have such a peaceful border with Canada, but imagine today if the Canadian military crossed the border into U.S. territory, killed an American citizen, and set fire to an American ship. What kind of crisis that would cause if any country did that. If any country sent military forces into U.S. territory and killed an American citizen, I think it would be very difficult to avoid war under those circumstances. I think a lot of Americans would want to declare war. And that was the case in 1837, 1838 as well, as news of these events spread. And the British didn't exactly do a lot to cool tempers on the American side of the border. They were seen to openly celebrate this raid. They even knighted the raid's commander, a man named Allan McNabb. This only further served to outrage Americans and bring them to the brink of war. The Van Buren administration, Martin Van Buren, who was president at the time, vehemently protested to the British government and put the U.S. Armed Forces on alert to be prepared for war. General Winfield Scott was ordered to the border to make preparations for the national defense if in case there was a war. He was also quietly ordered. This was not publicly part of his mission, but privately part of his mission was also to prevent Americans from continuing to funnel money and supplies to dissident forces on the Canadian side of the border to lower the tensions. President Van Buren stopped short of asking for a declaration of war and continued to attempt to resolve the dispute diplomatically. But it left the United States and the United Kingdom in this very uneasy, tense situation where they were on the brink of war. Neither side was ready to declare war, but neither side was ready to back down, and the slightest provocation at this point could have triggered another war. And then things got even worse. On November 2nd, 1840, a Canadian sheriff's deputy from Upper Canada was traveling through western New York. He stopped at a tavern in western New York and got to drinking, and he began talking, as drunk men do, and bragging that he had been there for the raid on the Caroline. And he was drunkenly bragging to American men in this tavern in America that his sword had, quote, drank the blood of 2 men on board the Caroline. Notwithstanding that there was only 1 death on board the Caroline, Alexander McLeod was arrested for the murder of Amos Durfee. In February, he was indicted by a New York grand jury on 17 charges, including murder and arson. The British minister in Washington, Henry Fox, objected, stating that McLeod wasn't even there on the Caroline, and he pointed out that McLeod doesn't even seem to know the basic facts of what happened on the Caroline. He couldn't have been there, but even if he was there, he was acting under the orders of the British government and can't be held personally liable for what happened. This seems like a contradictory argument, but for those of us who, like me, are in the legal profession, this is just lawyer speak. You see this as I've had the experience of practicing criminal defense in part of my career, and it's very common to say, you know, my client didn't shoot him, but if he did, it was in self-defense. And that's not seen as contradictory. So that's sort of what was going on here. The British minister was essentially saying McLeod didn't kill Durfee, but even if he did, he was acting under orders of the British government. So the Secretary of State at the time, Secretary Forsyth, essentially explained to the British that McLeod was charged under New York state law. And so the federal government had no authority to intervene in a matter of state law. For anyone who's unfamiliar with the United States' particular version of federalism, our whole Constitution and government is founded on the idea of separate and concurrent sovereignty between the state and the federal government. The Constitution of the United States lays out what the powers of the federal government are. And according to Madison, the architect of the Constitution, those powers are few and defined. Over the years and decades and centuries, they've been pretty broadly interpreted to give the federal government pretty sweeping power over most Americans' lives. But it took time for us to get there. And even today, you see this argument of state sovereignty versus federal sovereignty. The idea being that any power that is not explicitly given to the federal government in the Constitution is reserved for the states, and the federal government has no authority over that. You see this reappearing in different spheres all the time in American law. And in this case, particularly with criminal law, in most cases in the United States, general criminal law, things like murder and arson, the kinds of things that McLeod was charged with, would fall exclusively under the purview of state law. Unless there's some kind of federal element, like they crossed state lines while doing it, then that could make it federal. But for the most part, when you're talking about someone being charged with petty crime or with something like murder or arson in the United States, they're being charged under state law. And the federal government has no constitutional authority to intervene in something like that. So what you had in this situation was the British not really understanding that. The British were reaching out to the State Department saying, look, this guy didn't do anything, set him free, he's a British subject. And the federal government, the State Department, was coming back at them and saying, this is a state law matter. Our federal government has no authority over it because the crimes he's charged with happened entirely within the state of New York, and he's charged with violating New York state law, indicted by a New York grand jury in a New York state court. The federal government can't do anything. The British at one point questioned why they should even bother communicating with the federal government of the United States then, rather than sending individual ambassadors to the states. The British were outraged by this. The British Foreign Minister, Lord Palmerston, told the U.S. ambassador in London, Andrew Stevens, that, quote, if McLeod is executed, there must be war. All of this is happening, remember, during the transition to a new administration from the Van Buren administration to the administration of William Henry Harrison. And so the Harrison administration, pretty much as soon as they took office, inherited this diplomatic hot potato. And then a month into that administration, William Henry Harrison died, and you're dealing with the political crisis of the transition to the presidency of John Tyler. And so the federal government was not really in a position to be able to effectively respond to the British complaints. That's one of the reasons why Webster, when Tyler took power, did not resign. He felt it was so terribly important that he needed to stay on and help resolve this issue to prevent war with the British. And so Webster penned a reply to Lord Palmerston in late April. He said that he agreed in principle with the British position that even if McLeod had been there, he shouldn't be personally liable because he was acting under orders of the British government. However, he explained again what his predecessor had already explained to the British minister in Washington, Henry Fox, about these competing systems of sovereignty, American federalism, the idea that the federal government could not intervene in a state matter. So he was walking a very delicate line. He was saying, look, I agree with you. He should be set free, but I have no power to make that happen because that lies with the state. Now, behind the scenes, Webster was doing a lot to try and make sure that McLeod was not convicted and not executed. He made sure that McLeod had the best legal defense possible. He convinced a prominent local attorney, Joshua A. Spencer, to represent McLeod, and in a remarkable coincidence, Spencer was just after this appointed as the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of New York. It's quite the coincidence. After that, there was really nothing Webster could do. So Daniel Webster, along with everyone in the United States and Canada and the UK and other places, held their breath and watched this trial. In the true democratic tradition of America, this momentous decision of guilt or innocence, war and peace, was going to be decided by a jury of ordinary citizens in the state of New York. The trial began on October 4th, 1841, and went on for 8 days. On October 12th, 1841, less than 2 weeks before the Creole set sail from Richmond, Virginia, McLeod was acquitted on all charges. He presented alibis during the trial, showing that he wasn't there when the Caroline was attacked. It really appears, and there's debate over this, historians still debate over this to this day, because he was in a position in law enforcement where he might have been part of the raiding party, and then merely exaggerated his role in it. I am of the opinion, after reading through the transcript of his criminal trial, that he wasn't there. It seems to me he was simply an obnoxious bragger who drunkenly bragged about something that he hadn't actually done. Multiple witnesses at the trial established an alibi for him, and it was ultimately that alibi that the jury relied on to acquit him. He lacked basic knowledge of the basic facts of what had happened on the night of the raid in the Caroline affair. But regardless, this acquittal made both nations breathe a collective sigh of relief. But they couldn't breathe that sigh of relief for very long, because this was just a few days before the Creole affair unfolded. Border defenses on both sides of the border with Canada remained alert. It's also important to note one of the other important issues between the United States and Canada at this time was the border between Canada and Maine. It was disputed. Neither side agreed on where that border was. There had been tensions between people living in the area. There had even been violence. That issue was ongoing on top of all the other tensions. Back in Nassau on November 9th, 1841, Consul Bacon and First Mate Gifford having met, and Consul Bacon having heard the story of what happened on the Creole, at least having heard the First Mate Gifford's accounts of what happened on the Creole, the two of them went to see the governor of the Bahamas, the British governor of the Bahamas at the time, a man named Francis Cockburn. Cockburn seemed ready to help the Americans reassert control over the ship and sail away so that he didn't have to deal with this problem. Cockburn initially agreed with the American consul and First Mate Gifford that the ship should remain under guard and that none of the enslaved should be allowed to disembark on British soil. Cockburn himself was probably not well disposed to Americans. He had fought against the Americans in the War of 1812, and in fact he was the younger brother of Rear Admiral Sir George Cockburn, who had actually given the order for British troops to set fire to the White House during the War of 1812. But he was also aware of the level of tension between the US and the UK at this time. He did not want to be responsible for igniting the crisis that sparked a war. Governor Cockburn dispatched a detachment of soldiers from the British West India Regiment, consisting of 22 Afro-Caribbean enlisted men commanded by a white British officer, to board the ship and place the captives under guard. The white passengers and crew were immediately allowed to disembark and come ashore, including the severely wounded Captain Ensor, who was still clinging to life and was brought ashore to receive medical treatment. I think that if Cockburn could have kept the situation contained, that might have been the end of it. I think he would have preferred to avoid yet another diplomatic hot potato with the United States. I think his preference would have been to simply let First Mate Gifford and the crew reassert control of the ship and sail away and not be his problem. The issue was, after having initially made contact with the pilot boat crew, that crew now went ashore, and the news of what was happening in the harbor spread. We talked a bit about this in the last episode. At this point, slavery had only recently been abolished in the Bahamas and the British Caribbean generally. At this point, we were still only a few years removed from a massive slave uprising in Jamaica. And like we talked about in the last episode, on these islands, like the Bahamas, like New Providence Island, where Port of Nassau was located, the population was overwhelmingly Afro-Caribbean. Upwards of 80% of the population, most of whom had been formerly enslaved just a few years before, and so would have had massive sympathy for the plight of the people enslaved on board the Creole. And as news of what was happening in the harbor spread, the public came out to confront these events and to show their support for the Creole rebels and for the people enslaved on the Creole. And it led to this multi-day standoff where you had people both on shore and in small boats and harbor craft essentially coming out and surrounding the Creole and demanding that the people on board be set free. The governor at this point, politically, could not afford to let them sail away. He couldn't toss this hot potato away. He had to hold on to it. and he had to do something. Consul Bacon was continuously expressing his concern that the locals in these boats surrounding the Creole would attempt to storm the Creole and bring the people ashore by force. The soldiers on board the ship, like I mentioned, were from the British West India Regiment. All of the enlisted men that were sent to guard the ship, they were British soldiers, but they were Afro-Caribbean British soldiers commanded by a white officer. These soldiers would have been mingling with the enslaved on board the Creole. They likely themselves would have been freedmen, former slaves, more likely to sympathize with the captives than the captors. And so it left Cockburn in a really delicate situation. So for several days, this uneasy status quo prevailed. The soldiers guarded the ship so nobody stormed the ship. The people didn't come ashore. Cockburn had to figure out what to do. So he decided, I guess we better do an investigation. So he sent 2 magistrates, local British magistrates, aboard the ship to investigate, figure out what happened. And then once they had the report from the investigation from these magistrates, then he could decide what to do. This went on for 3 days, and then on November 12th, the status quo came crashing down. Cockburn apparently decided that he could not afford to do nothing. He could not keep them on the ship. He had to bring people ashore. Cockburn informed Consul Bacon and First Mate Gifford that the captives, who he called passengers, not cargo, not property, not slaves, passengers, that's very important, who were not implicated in the events of the mutiny, would be allowed to leave unmolested if they wished. He further informed them that those implicated in the potential criminal activity would likewise be brought to shore, but would be held in custody on suspicion of crimes committed. He finally told them that the courts in the Bahamas didn't have any jurisdiction over crimes committed on the high seas, and so he had to reach out to his superiors in London for further instructions. He was in a very delicate position. He couldn't do nothing. He had to act. He probably had fears of that 1831 slave revolt in the back of his mind, and he understood that if he completely sided with the Americans and let them sail away and keep these people in slavery, his own public would turn on him. At the same time, he couldn't simply set everybody free and let them go unpunished, because the Americans would never stand for that, and that could lead to war. He couldn't maintain the status quo because the tension was building between the locals and these soldiers, and he wasn't sure that he could trust these soldiers to be on his side. So he took the middle ground. It was the only thing to do. In a final attempt to try and prevent this outcome, Consul Bacon conspired with crewmen from 2 other American ships that happened to be in the harbor at that time, the Louisa and the Congress, to attempt to seize control of the Creole back from the rebels and from the British and sail it to the Florida Keys, only a few hundred miles away. Americans from these ships rowed out toward the Creole armed with muskets and cutlasses, basically a kind of nautical sword, intent on seizing the Creole back. The soldiers on board saw them coming and ordered them to withdraw or be fired upon. And there was a brief standoff where it looked like violence might result. Indeed, some of the soldiers did fire warning shots across the bow of the boat that these American crewmen were on. And ultimately, the American crewmen withdrew rather than risk their lives. Hearing of the American attempt to seize the ship back, local Afro-Bahamian men wielding clubs approached the ship in their own craft and completely surrounded it. It appeared they were intent on storming the ship themselves to free the captives. During their investigation, the Bahamian magistrates had identified Madison Washington, who we talked about in episode 1, the leader of the revolt, formerly the ship's cook and one of the enslaved men on the Creole, and 18 other male captives as, quote, mutineers that should be held in custody until it was determined what the jurisdiction was and whether they could be charged with a crime. To stave off what seemed to be a coming disaster, these 19 men were separated from the rest of the captives, and they were brought to shore and locked up in the local jail. The remaining 116 people enslaved on the Creole were given the choice to come ashore and obtain their freedom. 111 people made this choice. They came ashore and they became free. 5 enslaved people on the Creole, for whatever reason, chose to remain behind. As far as I know, nobody ever recorded their reasoning, why they stayed behind. It was 3 women and 2 children, a boy and a girl, chose to stay on board the Creole. I can only speculate about their reasoning. I have no idea why they made that choice. I'm sure they had complicated and what seemed like good reasons to make that choice. Maybe they had family back in the United States that they hoped to be reunited with. Maybe they just didn't trust the British to actually give them their freedom. Maybe they were afraid that they wouldn't be able to fend for themselves in the Bahamas. Whatever their reasoning, these 5 people chose to stay on board the Creole. And when the Creole sailed back to New Orleans 1 week later, they were on board and they were presumably sold at the New Orleans slave market. And we never hear from them again in the historical record. I wish that I could tell you what happened to them. We just don't know. First Mate Gifford would later testify at a trial relating to an insurance dispute over the Creole affair in Louisiana court that, somewhat nonsensically, he said that the vast majority of the enslaved people on the Creole actually wanted to stay behind, but they only left because they were being pressured by British authorities and by the local population, and that they felt they wouldn't have been able to safely make the choice to stay on the ship and stay in slavery. I will be discussing the details of this insurance case in the next episode, so I won't go into great detail on it here. But it's important to point out for now that the central question in that case was, what was the cause of the loss of this slave property by their owners? On one hand, if this was a preventable uprising that could have been prevented through taking measures to prevent slave uprising, then the revolt was caused by the ship owner and crew's own negligence, and the insurance company would not reimburse them. If, on the other hand, the loss was caused by British authorities or other outside forces interfering, officiously interfering, to use the legal terminology, then the insurance would cover it. And so Gifford had every reason to misrepresent the truth in his testimony, to make it seem like, oh yeah, they all would have loved to stay on board and stay in slavery had it not been for the British authorities intervening and forcing them to come to shore. Of course, Gifford at this time was still employed by the company that owned the ship that stood to get this insurance payout if they won the case, so he was very much testifying in favor of his employer because he wanted to keep his job. I just don't find it believable at all, his idea that the majority of these people would have preferred to stay slaves. And plenty of people, this isn't just my modern perspective leaking through, plenty of people at the time saw through this as well. And ultimately his testimony in that trial wasn't given very much weight for that reason, because it wasn't believable. Those 111 men, women, and children who had been enslaved on the Creole that were set free became free. I was not able to find any records in the historical record. As far as I know, it doesn't exist. We don't know what became of these people. On January 1st, 1842, the Richmond Enquirer, a Richmond, Virginia newspaper, published a letter from someone who had just returned from a voyage to Kingston, Jamaica, saying that a ship had arrived in Kingston Harbor, quote, with about 60 or 70 Negroes, and they were a portion of those taken into Nassau by the brig Creole. And in his book, The Creole Affair, Arthur T. Downey lends credence to that theory, that at least some of these now free men and women were relocated to and settled in Jamaica or other nearby British colonies. And he speculates that the British may have wanted to spread them out in case the Americans came looking for them. Wherever they went, whatever they did after this, from this day forward, they were free. They were free men and women, and unfortunately, history doesn't record what became of them, what all of their stories were. Some of them may have gone to Jamaica. Some of them may have gone to other islands in the Caribbean. Many of them probably stayed in the Bahamas, where their descendants live to this day. But wherever they went, whatever they did, they were set free, and their part in this story was now at an end. The fate of Madison Washington and the 18 other alleged mutineers was still to be decided. This question, Governor Coburn realized, was a diplomatically very sensitive question. He knew that the voices of the American slaveocracy in the American South would be out for blood. These men had risen up, and in asserting their freedom, they had killed a white man and nearly killed another white man. It was the sort of thing that the American slaveocracy was never going to stand for. He was also well aware that Americans north and south, for varied reasons, especially the Caroline Affair, were already out for British blood. There were many, not just in American society, but in American government, that were calling for war. On November 17th, Governor Cockburn penned a letter to Lord Stanley, the Secretary of State for War and Colonies in London. He reported the situation, the actions he had taken, and asked for instructions on what to do next. That same day, Consul Bacon penned a letter to the U.S. Secretary of State, Daniel Webster, with his detailed report of what happened. These letters carried news of this latest crisis to two countries that were already on the brink of war. It's impossible to know, and history does not record the thoughts or emotions of the 19 men sitting in the Nassau jailhouse at this point. I think it goes without saying that they were afraid. They were uncertain about their future. They may have taken some solace in the fact that their actions had led to the freedom of 111 other people, but they had to have been devastated that it had thus far failed to bring them their own freedom, and that their situation was now possibly worse than it had been before. They certainly understood that the American government, the American slaveocracy, would want to see them hanged for this, or worse. They probably were also afraid that the British government, which was just as much founded on white supremacy as the American government at this time, would not be too concerned with the value of their lives, and that the British would be more than willing to sacrifice them in order to maintain peace with the United States. They probably also just felt helpless as they sat there and waited for news to traverse back and forth across the Atlantic to decide their fate. I think given all of these circumstances put together, they probably were not optimistic about their fate. That's everything for today. Thank you for joining us. Please join us next time for the thrilling conclusion of what I have now determined will be a trilogy of episodes on the Creel Affair. We will learn the fate of Madison Washington and his fellow rebels, examine the reactions of the British and American governments to the crisis, and bring the story to its conclusion. Once again, I would like to thank the Blake Annex for helping to provide me with the space I'm using to record this podcast. If you like what you hear and you want to hear the next part of the story, please subscribe and give us a 5-star rating in whatever podcast platform you're listening to us on. It's really going to help us get this thing established and allow us to keep doing this podcast. Thank you all. I look forward to seeing you again next time.